On July 18, 1984, James Huberty kissed his wife goodbye as she relaxed on their bed after a day at the zoo with their daughters. But when she asked where he was going with his weapons and nearly 1,000 rounds of ammo, he would tell her that he was going hunting. Hunting for humans. Huberty would then drive to the McDonald's on West San Ysidro Boulevard and attack its patrons in a brutal and gruesome assault that would last over an hour and claim the lives of 22 people. At the time, this would be the deadliest attack of this kind from a lone perpetrator in US history. And to this day, almost 40 years later, it still remains the deadliest in California's history. Today, we dive into the origins, motive, and attack of James Huberty, as well as the aftermath of the 1984 San Ysidro McDonald's Massacre. Huberty would enter the McDonald's at exactly 4 p.m. on July 18, 1984. Although according to eyewitnesses, it was not his first target, instead originally opting to go to a Big Bear supermarket. But before he reached his destination, he would have a change of heart, or should I say, a change of mind, and instead began heading towards a local post office. Again, however, he would decide against this and pull into the parking lot of the McDonald's across the street from the post office, and only about 200 yards or 180 meters from his apartment. Huberty would spend almost no time in his car, instead immediately exiting his black Mercury, weapons in tow, along with a sack full of hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Then, he entered the McDonald's, which had 45 customers and at least 9 employees inside. On that day, a 16-year-old boy named John Arnold stood behind the counter taking orders like he had on any other. But as he attempted to count change, his concentration was broken when he heard somebody yelling something along the lines of, "Hey John, that guy's going to shoot you." When he looked up, he saw Huberty aiming his Winchester 12-gauge pump-action shotgun directly at him from what could be no more than 15 feet away. The person who had attempted to warn him was Guillermo Flores, the restaurant's assistant manager, and one of the only people to notice Huberty before the attack began. But although he knew he should be running, Arnold would have no time to react as Huberty pulled the trigger. But those who were expecting to hear the thundering crack of the shotgun instead only heard a quiet and inconsequential click. A joke, he thought, letting his guard down, and not a very funny one at that. As the store's manager, Neva Kane, came out to see what everyone was shouting about, Arnold would attempt to walk away from Huberty, rightfully angered that somebody would even attempt something so distasteful. But as Huberty fiddled with his shotgun, that deafening explosion of sound everyone had been expecting would finally arrive, as the weapon was discharged into the ceiling of the restaurant. Huberty would then take his semi-automatic 9mm Uzi and fire at Kane, hitting her just below the left eye. Then, he would shoot at Arnold with his shotgun, and although he was injured, Arnold would ultimately survive this attack. But Kane, who was only 22 at the time, would be dead within minutes. Now, as the friendly chatter or laughter stopped, Huberty would yell something akin to, "Everybody get on the ground, dirty swine, Vietnam assholes. I've killed 1,000, and I intend to kill 1,000 more." Huberty had reportedly always been obsessed with the idea of war, evident now by the fact that he was wearing a maroon shirt and camouflage khakis. But despite what he would say, he had never actually served. He reportedly had attempted to enlist once back during the Vietnam War, but was ultimately turned away due to medical issues with his kidneys. Now standing in a McDonald's in San Ysidro, armed to the teeth, he was living out whatever sick and twisted fantasy he had about what war would be like. One of the patrons, 25-year-old Victor Rivera, who was with his family, would take cover when the attack began. But now, in an attempt to protect not only his wife and 2 daughters, but everyone in the restaurant, he decided he would try to speak to Huberty, and began approaching him slowly, encouraging him to stop, to put down his weapons, and to spare everyone. Huberty would look at Rivera, and without saying a single word, open fire, hitting him 14 times. Then, as Rivera screamed in pain on the floor, Huberty would begin to scream back, telling him to shut up. By now, the reality of what was happening really began to set in. This wasn't a joke, it wasn't a disgruntled employee, it wasn't even a targeted attack. It was a maniac, and his target was everyone and anyone. So I'm sure the question on everyone's minds now was, why? Why now, and why them? And unfortunately, the answer was that there wasn't a reason why. James Oliver Huberty was born in Canton, Ohio on October 11th, 1942. He was the second child of 2 devotedly religious parents, and regularly attended service with them at one of the local United Methodist churches in the area. But as is typically the case with perpetrators of heinous crimes, his childhood was anything but smooth sailing. as is evidenced by the fact that in 1987, Huberty contracted polio at the age of 3. Quite literally like a scene out of Forrest Gump, Huberty would need to wear leg braces in order to minimize the possibility of the disease doing permanent damage to his legs. As I'm sure you can all imagine, Huberty would often be mocked by other children for this, and although the steel and leather braces would mostly succeed in their goal, Huberty would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. In 1950, after Huberty's father purchased a farm in the rural Mount Eaton area of Ohio, Huberty's traumatic childhood would truly start to form, as his mother, who objected to the idea of moving to such a rural and secluded place, would begin to take her frustration out on him, abusing him, locking him in closets, and eventually, without ever even visiting the farm, abandoning him, his sister Ruth, and their father when James was 8 years old. He would never see her again. One article in 1984 would suggest his mother would become a sidewalk preacher in Tucson, Arizona. At a young age, Huberty would begin to show interest in shooting and marksmanship, but would be labeled as a little boy who practiced incessantly with a target pistol by somebody who knew the family. He would graduate from Waynedale High School in 1960 to the surprise of his classmates, since many were convinced that due to his family's extreme religious beliefs, it would only be a matter of time before he enrolled in divinity school. However, Huberty would have a bit of a turnaround in his life when, after attempting a few different things, he would graduate with honors from the Pittsburgh Institute of Mortuary Science in 1984. But like his ability to make friends, although he had a skill for embalming, he just had a strange demeanor about him and struggled while interacting with clients at the mortuary where he worked. After 2 years, Huberty would give up on his career and became a welder. He would ultimately have great success with this, and again, although he was socially awkward at times, proved to be a hard worker, and would begin making around $30,000 a year welding for Babcock & Wilcox, roughly the equivalent of $170,000 a year today. He would purchase a nice home in the affluent part of town, and after that was destroyed by a fire in 1971, would buy another house on the same street in only about a month, later going on to build a 6-story apartment on the grounds of the previous home which he would manage. However, despite having a financial status many would be envious of, behind closed doors, Huberty's true colors began to show. Because in 1961, while attending Malone College for sociology, prior to his enrollment in the Mortuary Institute, he would meet a woman who seemed to be unshaken by his awkward personality, named Edna Markland, and in 1965, just before beginning work at the mortuary, the two would be wed. However, on several occasions, Huberty would need to speak to police in regards to reports that he would regularly hit Edna. After the two had children, 2 daughters, born in 1972 and 1974 respectively, the domestic violence towards his wife would trickle down to them as well. It is reported that he would slap, punch, and on at least one occasion hold knives up to the throats of the girls. Edna would encourage Huberty to seek counseling for his stress, this being what he would ultimately use to justify his actions towards his family. And of course, he would refuse. So instead, Edna developed a trick to calm Huberty down by pretending to tell his future with the use of tarot cards. Despite the fact Edna was completely making these predictions up, she would be able to plant ideas and offer Huberty advice, which he might not accept coming directly from her, but Huberty would allegedly believe most of these predictions and often took the advice offered. But his temper wouldn't stay a family secret for long, as Huberty would start to get the reputation around town of being a paranoid individual with a short fuse, often lashing out with insults and anger whenever he felt slighted by somebody. He would also keep a running list of everyone he feels has ever wronged him in his head, and these reasons could range from something serious to something as simple as accidentally stepping on his foot. He would call these incidents his debts, and after getting confronted when he encouraged his daughters to fight another group of girls while he hid and watched, he would tell their father that he believed in repaying his debts, good or bad. It is unknown if he was encouraging his children to solve their own issues in the way he's accustomed to, or if he was hoping to get them to do it on behalf of an issue he had with one of their parents. If being a short-tempered abuser wasn't bad enough, he would also be described as a conspiracy theorist who believed the government was conspiring against him, and as such, littered his home with supplies and weapons. These weapons were said to always be loaded, with the safety turned off, and often stored out in the open. A family friend would say that his house was loaded with weapons to such a degree that he could probably reach one wherever he was inside the home. The first true signs of mental instability would arrive, however, in November of 1982, because although it would be easy to describe the last 10 or so years of Huberty's life as prosperous, he allegedly immediately became concerned with his ability to support his family when the firm he worked for would abruptly close. Now, after the fact, a former coworker would come forward and say that Huberty had began expressing troubling thoughts to him in the days before the firm closed its doors for good. Things along the lines of, with the full intent to take everyone with him. It is unknown if this concerning behavior was ever reported. It was around this time Edna would say Huberty would also begin to hear voices, sometimes sitting quietly in a chair and waving his arms as if in conversation. One day Huberty would bound up to Edna excitedly, informing her that he just spoke to God, who was 10 feet tall with a gray beard, and Jesus, who was only 4 feet tall, although it is unclear what they were talking about. One night, as Edna watched Huberty wave his arms talking to whatever person he had been imagining that night, she felt the urge to slap him, to grab him by the collar and scream at him to snap out of it. Instead, she went to bed. In 1983, just a few months after being laid off, Huberty would have a mental health scare and pressed a loaded weapon against his skull. His wife would successfully convince him not to proceed, however. An unknown amount of time later, he would remark how he regretted letting his wife convince him not to do it. With a large amount of assets and no regular income coming in, the family, convinced that their money would go further in Mexico, no doubt spearheaded by Huberty, would sell their apartment building for the equivalent of $350,000, and their home for the equivalent of just $36,000 in cash, and move from Ohio to Tijuana, just south of the border. Reportedly, Huberty would leave the majority of the family's belongings in Ohio, but take his large stash of weapons with them. However, as it would seem, everyone in the family would adapt well, other than Huberty, who did not speak any Spanish and seemed reluctant to learn, and as a result, the move would only last about 3 months, or until 1984, when the family would decide to move back over the border into San Isidro, California, a relatively poor district of San Diego, with around 13,000 residents at the time, and located quite literally just north of the border of Mexico, meaning Huberty could likely still see Tijuana in the distance. Despite moving out of Mexico to a town directly on the border, I can't emphasize that enough, Huberty would become irritated with the fact that the vast majority of those around him were Mexican or Mexican-American, which often caused him to get into arguments with his neighbors at the apartment complex where he had moved to, when he would outwardly make rude comments towards them. One of his neighbors would allegedly strike up a friendly conversation in which he would disclose that he was a freelance bounty hunter, and that he was currently on the lookout for 2 Mexican men, one who had been known to steal trucks, and the other who was known to sell illicit substances. Reportedly, Huberty would turn to his neighbor and say, "Those fucking Mexicans are always getting into everybody's business." To which his neighbor would respond, "You know, I'm Mexican," before deciding Huberty was not worth his time, and left. Huberty's face would allegedly turn red, either through anger or embarrassment. This neighbor would never speak to Huberty again. However, despite these conflicts and issues, what Huberty would ultimately do was not believed to be racially motivated. Instead, the large death toll of Mexican or Mexican-American people was simply due to the fact it was the majority of people in the town where he lived. The death toll was just a reflection of the local demographic. Huberty would find work again eventually after receiving security training, but on July 10th, 8 days before the massacre, Huberty would lose his job for around the 4th and final time, and truly begin his downward spiral. Although Edna would say at the time that Huberty did not seem too upset that he had lost his job like he had with previous positions, likely confident he could get a new one, by July 15th, he would admit to his wife, possibly for the first time, that he believed he was having mental health problems. 2 days later, he would try to make an appointment with a mental health clinic, but due to his polite demeanor and not seeming manic enough, the operator felt his case could be considered non-emergency, and although he was informed that he would receive a call soon, in fact, later that day, his call was logged as non-crisis, and as such, would be handled within the next 48 hours. Huberty would spend the rest of the day quietly sitting next to the phone, awaiting a call that would never come. It would also be reported that the reception at the clinic had accidentally misspelled Huberty's last name as Schuberty, but I am unaware of how or why this may have delayed his case. The next day, Wednesday, July 18th, 1984, Huberty would have a great idea, and he would take his wife and children to the San Diego Zoo. While his daughters happily, now 12 and 10, ran around viewing the animals, Huberty would casually stroll with his wife and tell her, almost nonchalantly, that he believed that since the health clinic did not return his call, his life was effectively over, saying society had their chance. It is unknown what Huberty's wife's response was to this statement. Then, the family would eat lunch at a nearby McDonald's in Claremont, where Huberty would eat the chicken McNuggets and return home with his family, without incident. However, only about 3 hours later, as Huberty's wife relaxed on their bed, Huberty would walk up and kiss her, saying, "I want to kiss you goodbye." As he headed to the door, confused, as she was intending to start dinner soon, she would ask where he was intending to go. Reportedly, Huberty would stop at the door, pause for a moment, before turning back to his wife and saying, "Going hunting. Hunting for humans." Huberty would then grab his 9mm Browning HP, his semi-automatic 9mm Uzi, and his Winchester 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, as well as several hundred bullets for each. As he made his way to his front door, looking as if he was preparing for war, he spotted his oldest daughter, only 12 at the time, who was playing in the living room. He would look at her and say, "Goodbye. I won't be back." Then he would get into his black Mercury and drive away. In only about 4 minutes from when the door to his apartment closed, Huberty would open fire in the McDonald's and claim the lives of both Kane and Rivera. Then, Huberty would look to a group of 6 women and children seated across the restaurant. He would take the lives of 4 of them, including a pregnant woman named Jackie Reyes, who was only 18, and her 8-month-old baby Carlos. Several others would be injured, but one girl, 11-year-old Aurora Pena, would survive, thanks to Jackie shielding her with her body. Huberty would then execute a 62-year-old trucker and head toward a family by the play area, where a mother shielded her son and a father, their son's friend, below the tables. The mother and the couple's son would be killed by Huberty, and the father and friend would be hit multiple times, though both would survive. Then nearby, he would attack 3 women, one of which would be unharmed, another which would receive minor injuries, and a third fatally wounded. She would survive long enough to be transported to the hospital, but would succumb to her injuries a day later, making her the only mortally wounded victim to make it to the hospital. He would also execute a nearby man with a single shot to the chest. By this point, Huberty had already claimed the lives of 10 people, 11 if you count the woman who would later perish at the hospital. But in reality, it had only been about 4 or 5 minutes. And now, unaware of what was happening inside the restaurant, new patrons began to arrive and pull in, looking for something to eat. One couple would arrive with their 4-month-old baby and notice some of the broken glass around the restaurant and thought the building might have been under renovation. And for a split moment, as Huberty ran towards their car with his shotgun in hand, that he might be a repairman. He would blind the mother in one eye during his attack, as well as cripple one of her hands permanently, and critically injure their baby. The father would also be injured, but the least of the 3. As they took cover behind their vehicle, the mother would pass the infant to the father before collapsing. The father, in turn, would pass it to a nearby woman, who, in turn, would take it to the hospital, as the father helped his wife and others take shelter in a nearby building. All 3 would survive. That is when 3 boys approached the building on their bikes, aged around 10 to 12, only to also be attacked by Huberty. Out of the 3 friends, all would be struck, and only one would survive. He would later recount for reporters about his experience lying on the ground as his friends died. Then, as the public was finally becoming aware of the attack, an elderly couple and the last known civilians to approach the store would walk up to the doors. With a single shot from the shotgun, Huberty would kill the woman, and after having profanities thrown at him by her husband, who was now cradling her, would throw some of his own before taking him out as well. That is when Huberty greatly began to ignore whatever was happening outside, and instead returned his attention to those inside of the restaurant, specifically those behind the counter. Multiple people who would survive this ordeal would see Huberty adjust the radio on the counter to play music while he danced and began killing again. In the kitchen area, he would find 6 employees hiding together. One girl from the group would grab her friend's hand and begin to run. The one who initiated this would be killed, while the other would safely make it to the basement of the restaurant. one of the only places not entered by Huberty, and the location of 6 of only 10 people who would escape this ordeal uninjured. Huberty would turn his attention back to the remaining group, killing 3, and injuring the 4th, who would also crawl himself to the basement after being hit 5 times. During this attack, Huberty would also wound others who would not immediately be killed, like 19-year-old Jose Perez. Later, when Huberty would find him moaning in pain, he would be executed with a single shot. Also executed would be 2 women nearby. That is when Huberty would notice Aurora Pena looking at him, the little girl who was saved by the heroic actions of her pregnant aunt. Huberty would hurl obscenities at her, as well as throw things from behind the counter, before shooting at her with the shotgun and hitting her in the arm, neck, and jaw. This too, however, she would survive, despite the fact she would need to spend the most time in the hospital out of any other survivor. Then, around 5:17 p.m., 77 minutes after his assault started, Huberty walked towards the door of the restaurant, at which point a bullet pierced through his body, just below the heart and out of his back. This caused Huberty to drop his weapon and fall backwards onto the ground, just in front of the counter. It is believed that he died almost instantly. The shot would be taken by a SWAT sniper named Charles Foster, who was stationed at the post office directly across the street. Due to the large quantity of shots being taken by Huberty, the police were unsure if he was the only assailant inside, but quickly entered the restaurant and got confirmation from an injured survivor that he was acting alone. It is unknown exactly how many shots were taken by Huberty during his assault, but the police have determined that it was a minimum of 257. When they entered the restaurant to tend to and rescue survivors, they would need to step through a sea of blood and casings as they realized Huberty had claimed the lives of 21 people. 22 if you count the unborn baby of Jackie Reyes. 911 calls initially began coming through around 10 minutes after the attack began, and unfortunately, due to a mistake, the police would be sent to the wrong McDonald's, delaying their response by an additional 10 minutes. The SWAT team would also be delayed due to rush hour traffic. However, although they arrived roughly around 4:20 p.m., they would be unable to assist those inside or confront Huberty due to the fact the shattered glass on the ground and the spiderwebbing effect of the damaged windows caused light to reflect and obscure their vision inside. Couple this with the fact that they were unaware of the total number of attackers due to the sheer number of shots being fired, and the fact Huberty would occasionally approach the window and lay down fire towards the police who had arrived. So they were effectively stuck, only being able to receive those who were able to make it out of the restaurant on their own. Huberty would also shoot at a fire truck that had arrived and injured one inside. That is when all of the 147 officers who now occupied a large perimeter around the restaurant were given an order. If you have a clear shot of the gunman or gunmen, kill them. Foster, the SWAT member who would take the shot, had this to say about that moment. I never did see his face. The first time that I was actually able to see Huberty, he was sitting on the counter in about the middle of the building. Then he got up and started walking toward the door, where we had a better view of him from the neck down. He stopped about 6 feet from the door, so I took the shot. He dropped the Uzi and was thrown back a few feet. Originally, the San Diego Police Department would file reports stating that the majority of the killing occurred within the first few minutes of Huberty entering the restaurant. However, at the time, survivors suggested the opposite and stated the attack lasted for over 40 minutes. Several survivors would attempt to sue the San Diego Police Department, citing roughly 57 minutes between their arrival and Huberty's death. But the San Diego County Superior Court would ultimately rule that the police had acted accordingly and reasonably in their response. The fact that around 8 minutes passed between their order to kill Huberty and his death would also face criticism, to which some would note that the passing of time made no difference to the overall death toll. In the days following the massacre, McDonald's would suspend all radio and television advertising, and in an act of solidarity, so would Burger King. McDonald's would also receive several lawsuits before it was determined by the court, and I quote, McDonald's or any other business has no duty of care to protect patrons from an unforeseeable assault by a murderous madman, and the implemented security measures typically used by restaurants to deter criminals, such as guards and closed-circuit television cameras, could not possibly have deterred the predator, as he did not care about his own survival. Within 2 days, the McDonald's would be refurbished with plans to reopen, ultimately hoping to one day become, as quoted by one employee, just another McDonald's. However, after a discussion by the city and McDonald's as a company, it was determined that the restaurant would not reopen, and instead was later demolished on September 26th in the middle of the night. The land would be donated to the city on the stipulation no restaurant could be built there, although they had initially planned to build a memorial of their own. After several years, the city would sell the land to Southwestern College, who would then erect a memorial to the victims on the land. A new McDonald's would later be built about 2 blocks away. Edna and her children, who had no hand in the attack, would begin to receive death threats, and as a result, were forced to move around a bit, as well as attend school under fake names. However, Edna would go on to sue McDonald's herself, claiming her late husband's manic behavior was the result of the monosodium glutamate in their chicken McNuggets. Monosodium glutamate, also known as MSG, is a food enhancer that is generally considered safe, but has for many years been accused of being unhealthy for you. A rumor potentially spawned after World War II due to MSG's Japanese origins. One article would suggest McNuggets made up roughly 30% of all the meals Huberty ate. She would also attempt to sue his former employer, Babcock & Wilcox, claiming he was subjected to unsafe levels of lead and other harmful chemicals while he worked for them as a welder, due to lack of respiration equipment provided by the company. This suit may have had a little bit more credibility, however, as during Huberty's autopsy, they would allegedly note high levels of lead, which could have resulted from the 13 years he spent as a welder. However, even if he had been exposed to those chemicals, such a condition has not been known to lead to violent or manic outbursts, and as a result, both the case with McDonald's and Huberty's former employers would be dismissed in 1987. Edna would not receive a single penny of the $5 million in damages she was suing for, although she would receive a payment from McDonald's due to a fund they had created to help survivors of the massacre. Out of the $1,400,000 offered by McDonald's for this fund, Edna would receive $1,000 to have her husband cremated and his ashes taken to Ohio. Every year on the anniversary of the massacre, large amounts of flowers appear at the memorial at 460 West San Isidro Boulevard, as well as candles during the Day of the Dead. Across the 77 minutes spent inside the McDonald's, Huberty would kill 17 people within its walls, 4 outside, and injure 19 more. His father, Earl Vincent, would also be tracked down the day after the massacre, still living in Mount Eaton, and say, "Yesterday was the worst day of my life. I feel so sorry for those people." Huberty's wife would tell reporters that she knew some of the parents of the children who were killed due to the fact that they attended school with her own daughters. However, she said she had not contacted them, stating, "What could you say? Can you raise the dead? I really don't know what they think, and I really don't care. I have a very simple philosophy. People live because they don't die, and some days I say they live because they're not lucky enough to die." And hearing that quote, I can't help but think that she is referring to herself. Well, that's about it. If you enjoyed this video, I think you'll like this one about 5 YouTubers who committed horrible crimes. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.